Hi, thank you for watching 9 Prep's video on the ACT Science section, where we'll be talking about test taking tips and tricks to master the ACT Science. Important information about the test. The subjects are always in the same order. The science section will come fourth, which is usually the last section unless you're taking the ACT with writing. You cannot work ahead or go back if you have time left at the end of a section. Your test will be disqualified and not scored if you do this. So only make sure you're working on science when you're allowed to work on science. You're also not allowed to use a calculator on the science section. The ACT is not like tests that you take at school, so you need a proven strategy that works for this type of test. Now, if you have watched any of our other strategy videos, the next couple slides may be a little repetitive for you, but that's okay. It's good to review, so let's get into it. You cannot expect to make a 36 on the ACT. You can't expect to get 100% of the answers correct. On a biology test at school, it's possible for every student in the class to study really hard and make an A on the test. The ACT is graded on a curve, one that looks a lot like a bell, which means that only a small percentage of students will make the lowest and highest scores on the test, and the majority of students will fall somewhere in the middle. Therefore, your score is not only determined by how many questions that you answer correctly, it's also determined by how you compare to the other students who took the exact same test as you. Don't finish the test. So this might sound crazy, but you heard us correctly. You do not have to finish the test in order to get a good score on the ACT. Here's how that looks on the science section. 16 questions correct gives you a score of a 16. 22 questions correct gives you a score of a 20. 29 questions correct is a score of a 25. And 33 questions correct is a score of a 28. The ACT does not count off for wrong answer choices, so you will guess on the questions that you do not make it to. Put the same letter on all questions where you are blindly guessing. So you want to make sure that you have like a letter of the day when you go in. So a letter that corresponds. So A and F, B and G, C and H, J and D. You don't want to pick like F and D because you're going to get less right. So make sure that you're picking one letter for that test. Rushing is not allowed. More careless errors happen when you rush. So slowing down and focusing on getting every question that you see correct will cut down on the number of careless errors. When you begin the test, you have one goal, and that's to answer the first question correctly. Once you accomplish that goal, your next goal is to answer the next question correctly, and so on. Rushing to get to the end of the test and missing a bunch of questions along the way is the best way to not get the score that you want. So, important things to know on science, you have 40 questions and you're given 35 minutes to complete this section. This test will be split into 6 passages with 6 or 7 questions each. The questions and passages do not get harder as you go. You will not read first. This is usually a waste of time, so go straight to the first question on that passage, and if you need to go back to the passage for an answer choice, then do so, but you will find that you use the figures, tables, and charts way more than the text. Not rushing on the science helps us be sure to look at the correct figure or graph, eliminate answer choices that cannot possibly be correct, and avoid careless errors. The science test is like an open book test. So 98% of the answer choices can be found in the passage. Most of them will be found using the figures, tables, and charts, but every once in a while there will be answers that come from the text. There are only 1 or 2 questions per science test that will require some sort of outside knowledge. And there's really no way to know what they're going to test you on. It could be something about a Punnett square from biology, or maybe a chemical equation from chemistry, but we will talk about some potential outside knowledge topics in other videos. The science section has little to do with actual science. So even if you hate science at school, you can still ace the science section on the ACT. It's mainly just testing you on interpreting charts, graphs, figures, tables, etc. The answers are in the passage. You just have to slow down and find them. The passages are not in the same order. There are 3 different types of passages on the science test: data interpretation, experimental, and conflicting viewpoints. The data interpretation passage will give you charts, graphs, figures, or tables, and you will have to find your answers based on the information given. There will be 2 or 3 of this passage type each test. In this example, notice how there are several tables and even a figure, but very little text. The experimental or studies passage is very similar to the data interpretation passage, in which that you will find your answers based on the information given. However, there will be several experiments or studies, and sometimes you may be asked to compare or contrast the different experiments. There will also be 2 or 3 of this type of passage. We see in this example that there are 2 experiments listed as experiment 1 and experiment 2. They will always either be experiments or studies. For the conflicting viewpoints passage, there is only one of this type, and it is sometimes called the text-heavy passage because it is predominantly text. You will skip this passage and come back to it if you have time. This passage presents you with multiple opinions on the same subject matter. You will have to read more for this passage than any other, which makes it take a little bit more time. However, you still want to go straight to the questions to figure out where you should look for that answer. Here we see 2 different examples of the conflicting viewpoints passages. On the left, we see scientist 1, 2, and 3, and on the right, we see hypothesis 1, 2, and 3. Notice how there are a ton of text in both of these. There is a ton of text in both of these. And there is also conflicting viewpoints, scientists and hypothesis. Work smarter, not harder. On the ACT Science test, you will leave the conflicting viewpoints passage for last. Since this passage takes the most time to complete, we want to skip it. The passages are not in the same order, so whenever you come across the text-heavy passage, you will skip it and bubble in your letter of the day on your answer document. So how to find the text-heavy passage? Remember that this passage always has conflicting viewpoints. It'll be one of the following. So researchers, students, hypotheses, or scientists. This passage always will have 7 questions. It usually has very few charts, graphs, and figures, as we saw in the 2 examples earlier. Sometimes it may have repeated answer choices, such as the following, where you have scientist 1, scientist 1, 2, and 3, or neither scientist, things like that. Alright, so let's say on this particular science test, the text-heavy passage is the 3rd passage. We are going to put letter of the day for those 7 questions. We can expect to get at least 1/4 of those answers correct, which would mean we get at least 1 correct. On the other 5 passages, you will be able to slow down and get more answers correct, because now we only have 33 questions to do within the 35 minutes. The goal is to not miss more than 1 question per passage on the 5 that you're able to complete. If we do this correctly, that means that we've gotten 29 out of the 40 questions correct. And if we remember from earlier, 29 questions on the science test would give us a score of a 25, which is a great score. A 25 on the science test is higher than 75% of test takers. So that is great. You're in the top quarter of test takers. Wrong answer choices on the science test can be very tempting. They will use opposite answer choices like increase and decrease, positive and negative, birth and death rate. They will use completely false answer choices. Maybe a proton has a charge of -1, or a boiling point of water is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Things that we know are just untrue. I want you to get in the habit of breaking down each question. So this one says, according to figure 1, the mass of cheese remaining at 4 hours was closest to which of the following values? So our first step is to make sure that we're looking in the right place. So the question says, according to figure 1. So we need to find figure 1. We have it here for you. So figure 1 is this bar graph. So we're going to make sure we look at figure 1. You don't have the other ones, but typically you would have multiple figures or charts. So make sure that you're looking at the correct one. Step 2 is to know what we are looking for. So they ask us for the mass of cheese remaining. So we're looking for mass of food remaining we see on the y-axis. So we're going to look there. Also make sure that you're looking at the right thing. So they're asking for the mass of cheese remaining. There are 4 different things here. So look at your key. We see that cheese is the solid white line. So we're going to be looking at the solid white line. All right, lastly, where do we see time? They're asking for the mass of cheese remaining at 4 hours. So if we look at figure 1, we see time is on the x-axis. So let's zoom in a little bit here. We're going to find 4 hours. So we see that at 4 hours, if we look at cheese, which is again that solid white line, it's a little bit over 180, but not quite to 190. So it has to be 185, C. If you see a chemical equation or a mathematical formula in the passage, you should expect to use it on at least one question. They typically don't put that in there for no reason. This may be a chemical equation that you're familiar with, like photosynthesis, or it could be something that you've never seen before. Level of difficulty. So typically, the harder, the more confusing the charts and graphs appear, the easier the questions will be. This also works the opposite way as well. So if the charts and graphs are pretty straightforward, then you should expect the questions to be a little bit harder. And they do this just so that each passage stays at the same level of difficulty. So let's look at some examples. We see that this graph is pretty simple. It's just a bar graph, sort of like the one that we looked at earlier. So we would expect the questions to be a little bit more challenging, whereas in this graph, it's a little bit more complex. They have a lot more going on. So we would expect the questions to be a little bit easier, just because it takes longer for you to interpret the graph. Remember that the ACT only allows the use of calculators on the mathematics section. So you are not allowed to use a calculator on the science test. Sometimes you will have to do simple math on the science test, and we will talk about an example. So if we look at this one, it says at 1 atmosphere of pressure, the temperature at which CH2I2 boils is how much greater than the temperature at which CH4 boils? So we need to look at table 1 and find the boiling point of both of these chemical compounds. So diadomethane, CH2I2, down here at the bottom, has a boiling point of 182 Celsius. And then methane, CH4, at the top, has a boiling point of negative 162. Now the question asks for the temperature at which diadomethane boils is how much greater than the temperature at which methane boils. So they're just asking us for the difference in their boiling point. So to do this, we would subtract, we would say 182 minus negative 162, which we would just add those numbers. So that would give us 344, or H. Now, If math scares you, like it does some people, that's fine. You can get this question correct without doing any actual written math. So we could round diatomethane's boiling point up to 200. Just make an easy number. So diatomethane, 200. Methane, let's round that down to 150. Okay. So now when we add those numbers, 200 plus 150 is 350. There's only one answer choice that's even a little bit close to that, and it has to be 344. So even if you hate math, you can still typically get the math questions correct on science. After watching this video, start by practicing real untimed ACT tests. Focus on getting all but one question correct on each passage. When you do miss a question, make sure that you go back and know why you missed it. You want to make sure that you can get that type of question correct if it's asked in the future. Don't worry about your timing. Only start doing time tests when your accuracy has improved. Practice the text-heavy passages when you are doing untimed tests. However, remember that we are not expecting you to finish this passage on a time test. This would be the passage that you're going to guess your letter of the day. A lot of times students will come to us saying that they are struggling to finish the science test and that they want to focus on improving their speed. Most of the time, these students actually need to work on improving their accuracy, not speed. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say that this student is worried that they cannot finish the test in the time allowed. Let's say that they scored a 21 on science, but they weren't able to get to the last passage, leaving them to guess on 7 questions. So if we only had to guess on 7 questions, that means we were able to answer 33 of them. Now, 22 questions correct gives us a score of 21, which is what this student has. If the student was able to get to number 33, that means that we're missing 11 questions along the way. That's almost 1/3, or it is 1/3. So we want to take a look at how the student is doing on each passage. A lot of times we will see this type of scenario where they are missing a lot of questions per passage and they're not finishing the test and having to guess on the last passage. If finishing was really the issue, then the student would be getting all of the questions that they do see correct. If we did get 7 more correct answers, that would increase our score from a 21 to a 25. So we're getting 29 correct answers. This student would still not need to answer any more questions than they did on the test before. Right? If we get to number 33, we could still miss 4 questions and end up with the 25. If a student gets to number 33 and gets them all correct, we would expect them to get around a 28 on the science section. A student who has a 28 on science and is struggling to finish the test really does need to work on getting farther. But a student who is struggling to finish but missing a lot of questions along the way needs to focus on improving their accuracy. You can tweak the strategy to fit your given goal. So let's say you don't need a 25. Let's say you just need a 21 for Tennessee Hope Scholarship. That means that we need less correct answers. No matter what your goal is, if it is 25 or 35, look at the answer sheet to see how many questions you need to get correct. And remember, you have to practice the test questions so that you know how to get the correct answers. Let's take a look at a score chart again. You can look at your goal score for the science section to determine how many questions that you need to get correct on this test. This can help you be less worried about finishing and more concerned with accuracy along the way. If you just are looking for a 20 on the science section, we would need to get at least 20 questions correct. That is half of the questions on the science test. So there's no reason that we need to finish the science test. If we're able to answer 20 questions with 100% accuracy, that can get us to our goal. So, we want to slow down and focus on getting each question correct rather than finishing the test. As a review, work on your accuracy on the ACT science test questions. And also check out our additional videos for specific outside knowledge concepts that you may need to know. Want more? Follow 901 Prep on social media at 901 Prep, and also visit our websites for more videos at 901prep.com. Thanks for watching.